Hey everyone, Uli Salazar here, coming to you from Electrical Audio in Chicago with a very special one-of-a-kind presentation. In this feature, we're going to be looking at two drum kits that share a nearly identical build spec but made some 50 years apart, analyzing exactly how similar these two kits are sonically. We have two very special guests joining us for this project. Founding member and drummer of the legendary rock band Cheap Trick, Mr. Bun E on the drums. And behind the controls here at the studio, we have renowned audio engineer and producer, Steve Albini. Let's check into Studio A.
Hi, I'm Bun E, and I'm sitting behind a beautiful Silver Sparkle 1966 super classic outfit from Ludwig. Let's talk about the construction of the shell. It's a 3-ply shell, mahogany, poplar mahogany. Ludwig came up with this in 1923 and they called it aerocraft construction, and they were using plywoods. It was stronger and it was a good construction. It lasted till 1967, which is, in dog years, is about 1 million years for drums. Turned into be a perfect idea by Mr. Ludwig and his brother. Whoever thought this stuff would still be around in the 60s? You know, it's pretty good. I'm sitting behind a Legacy Mahogany Fab outfit. The finish on this set is vintage oyster blue. It's a remake of the 1960s oyster blue. The shell construction is 3-ply shell. We call it 3-ply mahogany. It's mahogany, poplar, mahogany. And there's a maple reinforcement hoop in each of the drums on top and bottom to keep the drumming around over time. The bearing edge on the Legacy shell is a 1/4 inch roundover from the outside in, and a 30-degree bevel cut from the inside meeting the roundover. What this does is brings out more of the resonance of the shell, brings out better lows and better mids in my opinion. I really like it.
So we just got done reviewing the low tuning setting of the two 3-ply mahogany kits, and we definitely noticed some really interesting things, not only in person in the studio when we were recording the exercise, but after the fact reviewing the final mix down of everything. What were some of the things that stood out to you?
I was surprised how much alike they were. The new floor tom rang forever in my opinion. The old floor tom didn't sound significantly different, except it just right after the hit, it tailed off a little more. The old rack tom was jumped off the kit. It was singing out a lot more than I expected. But really, it was the main thing was that these kits were were like brothers to me. They weren't identical twin brothers, but they were from the same family. One kit didn't sound a mile away from the other. They sounded like they were from the same bunch. You know,
Yeah, it was definitely very obvious when both kits were played. They both had that sonically rich Ludwig tone. You knew what you were listening to. Oh. And that's really fascinating, to be able to take the archetype of a kit made in the 60s, replicate that with modern refinements and precision in a few areas, preserve everything from that 60s kit, but give the player a little bit more and give the experience a little bit more.
Yeah, there's a lot more options with the new stuff. Everything the old kit does, the new kit can do too, I think. And then I think the new kit does more, of course. More better in my famous words.
Yeah, there was some really cool, unique sweet spots in the silver kit that I noticed. The kick drum sounded really smooth. The floor tom was really smooth. But the rack tom, it had a nice body, but it was almost too overbearing. I sort of felt like it sat higher in the mix acoustically over the snare drum and everything else. And when you got to the Legacy Mahogany kit, everything was much more evenly balanced, even to the point where the snare may have been slightly higher naturally in presence over the toms, which you kind of want, because you don't want to lose out your grace notes. And even the beat you were doing had some grace notes in there, and the clarity of those within you writing on the toms was very evident in that.
Yeah, you know, the snare drum is the lead instrument, and you don't want it to get overcome by the drums surrounding it. And the new stuff works well that way. It really does.
So we just got done reviewing the medium tuning of the 3-ply kits. That was pretty interesting too. Definitely no surprises. I kind of felt like I knew where this was going to go. What did you think?
I was surprised with the floor tom.
Yeah.
It sounded a lot more like a floor tom at medium tuning than it did at low tuning.
Yeah, that was probably the sweet spot for the two kits.
Yeah, it kind of came up into the mix a bit. And you know, the old kits, the higher I tune them, the more I like them.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of those characteristics that you like out of the old kits when you sort of crank them up and that sort of mid-range bite to the attack?
Well, you know, when I think of a 60s kit, I go back to like my favorite 60s records. There's a song by the Rolling Stones called Stupid Girl that starts out with a tom lick and a floor tom lick. And so whenever I sit down on a 60s kit, I do the Stupid Girl lick and go, okay, did these sound like Charlie's drums sounded like in RCA studios in 1965, you know, type of thing. And then I throw in some You Won't See Me licks by Ringo to see how the tom-toms sound on hoop shots and stuff. And, you know, the medium tuning brings up, I call it clank. The stuff sounds a little clankier.
Yeah.
The hoops bring out a little more of the sound. And maybe it's the drums aren't resonating as much and the sticks are making more of the noise. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But, you know, the stuff starts to dial in. It really does.
And that's a fascinating thing that you mentioned about sort of the attack and the noise of the attack sort of overpowering the natural acoustic of the drums themselves. One of the things I picked up on between the two kits was the higher you got, or obviously going from low to mid in this case, the vintage kit, the note was sort of interrupted. The note wasn't balanced. There wasn't a balanced decay to it. But when you looked at the new kit, the attack was very balanced, very smooth, and there was a nice taper of the note itself, tapered down, right? And a lot of that probably has to come from a more precise bearing edge. And that's kind of one of the benefits of a modern build. It's you have a true edge and the head is seated evenly so that both the top and bottom are responding in a way that the note is expressed a little bit more evenly.
Yeah, I think modern workmanship comes into play on this, and a better made drum just sounds a little better, and a better made drum is usually a newer drum. I've always been, people go, what's your favorite drum set? And I always go, well, my latest drum set is my favorite because it's the best ones they ever made.
Yeah.
And it's been like that for decades now. So
yeah. I think it was really cool, you know, going back to the sweet spot. I've always felt, you know, both of us come from, you know, collecting vintage drums for years now, and there's always something unique about every vintage kit you come across, and there's always a sweet spot. And that's kind of one of the cool things about vintage drums is there's a sweet spot, and and sometimes you know, that results in it being a one-trick pony, but if that's what you needed to do, that's perfect, right?
Yep.
But you know, on the other side of things, with a modern kit like the Legacy Mahogany that we just saw, you get a lot of the same elements and nuances that you get out of vintage kit, but a little bit more flexibility. And for today's player, that makes a lot more sense because today's players are definitely, the expectation is to adapt to different musical settings, right? Different genres. You're playing pop one day, you're playing jazz the next day, especially if you're really workhorse type drummer, where you're doing a gig every other weekend or every weekend with a different band. You know, you want a few different tools to get the job done, and sometimes a newer kit has that adaptability and that versatility that a vintage kit doesn't.
You know, this flexibility is a big thing in the studio, and drummers don't realize how big a deal this can be till you get in the studio. I remember on our first album trying to tune the second rack tom on the kit for the song I'm playing, the riff, the Flam triplet riff I'm playing. I worked on that drum for an hour trying to get tuning.
Geez.
And then Jack Douglas, the producer, said, let me do this. And he went out there for a couple hours and sat out there tuning the bottom head and the top head and hitting things. And we sat in the booth and we're thinking, here goes $200 an hour just flying by.
Just to tune a rack tom.
And I was like, is he ever going to get this stupid drum in tune and all this kind of stuff? And with new drums and the new toms, this doesn't happen in the studio. The guy goes, this is too high, we want it tuned lower. You do a few turns with a key, and if your bottom head's in tune, it dials right in. There's no such thing as taking 2 hours to work on a rack tom these days in the studio with new drums because you just don't have to.
Yeah.
It just saves a lot of time. And in a live situation, the same thing. So if the leader goes, I want them more like this, you can do it with a few turns of a drum key, and you have so many more options with new drums. You don't have, most of the old drums are just like you said, there's a sweet spot, and then after that, you're kind of in Dutch if you're looking for anything outside of the sweet spot.
Yeah. The cool thing, I wish we got this on tape when we were down at Electrical, but at the end of this whole exercise, Steve walks into the studio and he comments like, man, if I had to record drums tomorrow and I had one kit to choose out of these two, it'd be the Legacy Mahogany. And again, I think it came down to how quick we were able to sort of tune it, but also how consistently rich it sounded, how consistently balanced it sounded too, because it took a lot of work off of his plate because he wasn't trying to mix things down to balance things out, or nothing was overwhelming in that, you know. And we didn't want to spend time putting in a lot of work in mixing and editing. We really wanted to pick up the nuances of the room, the nuances of the kit, and the fact that that kit with very little work spoke so well and so balanced. From an engineer's perspective, for him to say and even call that out and say, wow, like those drums had something special, even down to the modern Supraphonic, because let's not forget, I mean, you had a vintage Supra on the vintage kit and a modern one, and you know, we can't ignore the similarities between the two, but also some of the unique things that a new one does, and obviously there's plenty of unique things that a vintage one does.
When Steve Albini likes a drum set, you got to go with a drum set. And he's got 60s kits in the basement.
Yeah.
He's got a nice mod orange kit down there I've seen when we were in there that I tried to get from him. But with Steve, you know, when he mics up a kit, he does some close mics, then he does 10 foot away, then he does 20 foot away, then he does 30 foot away. Then he looks for the best drum sound for the song and for the kit and all that. And with a new kit, you know, you don't need necessarily 5 mics on a drum set to make sure this room sounds good or this kind of thing. They dial in so much faster, and you don't go into a studio to sit there and get sounds. You know, you go in to get performances. So yeah, the faster the better.
Definitely. All right, well, let's take a look at the high tuning setting of the 3-ply kits. All right, so we just got done reviewing high tuning. Some interesting things there. Maybe not really surprises, but definitely some interesting things.
The high tuning, they sure sound like 60s drums.
Yeah.
You know, I can hear a little of that Take 5 sound in there. I can hear that Stupid Girls Rolling Stones Ludwig sound from RCA Studios out west, and you know, it's got that. They cranked them up in the 60s. They didn't go for too deep. The 70s sound was not the 60s sound.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, tuning, especially for drums in that era, I feel like high tuning is really where you got the drum to sing the most, because at the low tuning, that's when you really brought out the imperfections of the bearing edge. So to kind of overwrite that, tuning high probably made the most sense back then, but also with response too. You know, tuning gives you that stick response, that stick bounce. You know, you didn't have bashers back then like you do today, so guys really relied on stick technique and bounce in their playing.
There wasn't a hoop shot on every hit in the 60s because you know, the stages weren't that big and the amps weren't that big and the venues weren't that big. So yeah, you played the head a lot more than you played the hoop.
Definitely. I felt like when we looked at the 60s kit in all three tunings, but by the time we got to the high tuning, it became obvious how unbalanced the kit as a whole was. That high tom was really over the mix compared to the rest of the drums.
It jumps out on the footage.
Yeah. Yeah, it really stood out, and it was funny when we were watching that. I was just thinking to myself, I was like, man, I'd love to find a 26-inch Silver Sparkle bass drum and put that 13 with it, because it'll contend with it from a presence standpoint, right?
It had little bonzo elements in it.
Yeah.
It did, you know, because he cranked his rack way up there.
Yeah.
So his 14 or 15-inch tom was probably tuned to about the same note that 13-inch tom.
Yeah, so to get the presence out of a 13 like that was definitely unexpected, but I saw that trend of that 13 being a little hot compared to the other drums, but it became even more pronounced in the high tuning. And then when you look at the blue kit, though, everything was a little bit more in line. I felt like the tone, you know, again, it still preserved a lot of the same attack of the 60s kit, but the tone was a little bit more focused and maybe a little bit rounder because it had a little more focus and got rid of all the noise and unbalanced, you know, stuff that was going on with the 60s kit.
Yeah, it had I think round is the best word to describe it. It had a nice full tone, and the bad notes really weren't there, and there was really no evidence of a hoop on a lot of it. The drum came through really nice.
Yeah, it looked like, you know, no drum was working harder than the other.
I thought the Legacy kit, all the drums belonged together a lot more than they did on the 60s kit when I was playing both of them. It was just felt like more one kit, and then playing live, of course, you don't want to sit there and try and do your own mix while you're playing. You know, like on the 60s kit, that 13, if you went around the whole kit, it would be boom, 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 boom. Suddenly, the one tom jumped out of the mix.
Yeah, and that's probably, you know, I would say one of the challenges that people would face if they went into the studio with a vintage kit and were trying to go with the minimalistic mic approach, is that they'll get a lot out of one drum that they don't want. You know, they're not gonna end up recording a balanced tone, and it'll force them to mic up the whole kit so that they can sort of either dial down or bring up something that is getting lost in a room mic setting.
Yeah, it would be a big issue in the studio with the 60s kit if you were just miking two overheads and a bass drum mic. Your entire kit, when you went around, it wouldn't be quite in balance, and miking the drums individually, then you would lose the sound of the overheads. It's more difficult to use a 2 or 3 mic setup on a 60s kit than it is on a new kit. You know, I gigged last month with my Heritage Green Legacy kit, which is the basic same outfit that Carter has, and I did a triplet drum lick at the end, just your basic John Bonham triplets. And people came up to me afterwards, a couple drummers came up and they went, okay, where's the extra pedal hidden? Where do you have it up here? The floor tom matched the bass drum. I took the floor tom and tuned it down a bit.
Oh, nice.
I mean, but the low end came out, but the whole kit balanced out, and I was only using 2 overheads and a bass drum mic, and the whole kit balanced out in the mix, just right, dialed in. And for the drum break, my brother came up and leaned over the kit, and he's like, I thought you had a double pedal on this thing. And I'm like, no. And yeah, the new kit balances out a lot better, and they dial right in.
Well, there you have it, drummers, the very first ever Face Off from Ludwig. What will we do next?
more face-offs.